Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here. This is sort of a nostalgic return. I can't even remember. The last Ojai event was at Camp Shalom. I can't remember. It must have been 3 years since we were all together here under the teaching tree. In some ways, a lot of water over the dam. In other ways, 5 minutes ago. I just come from 2 days of speaking in Los Angeles to large audiences which demand a sort of formal intensity that you thankfully relieved me of this morning. I guess well, how many people are familiar with my books or have been to workshops in the past? Is there anybody who's just utterly unfamiliar? Okay. Well, so we'll work from that benchmark out. I never imagined that I would end up sitting in this position and pontificating on the nature of life and history and global human destiny. I started out simply with a love of nature. I was persecuted as a child in my physical education classes, so I spent a lot of time on my own, and I grew up in western Colorado where there is a lot of exposed sedimentary rock, and some of it has dinosaurs pressed into it. And I could always feel these dinosaurs. The largest dinosaur ever found was found a few years ago near Delta, Colorado, about 30 miles from where I grew up. And all the time I was growing up, I knew that sucker was out there. But I could never walk to it. If I could have, probably my career would have taken a different turn. But my interest in fossils, I remember I had an uncle who gave me a book when I was about 8 years old of fossils. And it had one of those charts in the front of it where it shows 5 billion years, and then the last half inch is expanded to the next column, and then the last half inch is expanded to the next column. And so I saw that human history was a hairline crack at the bottom of the column furthest to the right. And I got the concept of how old, not the universe, but the Earth is. And it was a dizzying perspective. The town I grew up in, if you read Time magazine, you were persecuted as a left-wing intellectual. The town I grew up in once made it into Ripley's Believe It or Not as a place that had more Christian churches per capita than any town of its size in the United States. This was a town of 1,600 people with 42 Christian churches thriving. When I was a kid, I thought street corners were for churches. I didn't know you could have buildings on street corners that weren't churches. And I would go up these dry arroyos with my rock pick, looking for fossil shells and dinosaur bones and this sort of thing, brachiopods. And in the solitude, because I would often not be able to con my little friends into attending me, because they learned quickly that it was hotter out there than decent people could tolerate. And also, I have to confess, whenever I invited someone to come along, it was with the thought that they would carry back the specimens. So they were essentially pack burros for my fossil expeditions. And then I had an uncle who was an old rock hound, and he introduced me to the concept of not splitting apart strata to see ancient forms of life, but slicing rocks up and polishing them to reveal the light and the color and sometimes the crystal cavities that were hidden inside them. And so very early on, I got this idea that the surface of things is not where attention should rest, that you have to, as Ahab tells Starbuck in Moby Dick, you have to seek the little lower layer. And under the surface of things is another reality, a reality that reaches, in some cases, back to the birth of the planet, practically, or in other cases, in other dimensions. I had a fixation with meteorites at one time, and butterflies, and rocketry. And all of these things were about a certain thrill, a certain iridescence that could be coaxed out of physical phenomena if you would not just simply dismiss them and pass over them. And as a little kid, I had very bad eyes. I still do, but I wear contact lenses. But at that time, I wore very thick bifocal lenses. And my mother, bless her heart, who was cut from somehow different cloth than all the people around me, read Aldous Huxley's book, The Art of Seeing, which I had an occasion to look at it in the past year, and I was amazed how much of my own attitude toward life is contained in this fairly trivial book. You know, Huxley had terrible eyes, too, and he discovered the so-called Batesian method of eye exercises and eye health, which at that time, we're talking 1954 or so, was completely sky blue crackpot type stuff. I mean, this was the Eisenhower era. And the exercises that I learned when my mother took me to this, I guess you would say, Batesian therapist, were exercises in attention to the exterior world. And then the other form of exercise was what the rest of American society wasn't going to encounter for 15 years and then would encounter as Buddhist visualization. But for us, it was just close your eyes and the therapist would create capsules in the air through narrative. And it was an eye exercise. And so it introduced me to the idea of sitting still and watching what's going on behind closed eyelids. What fascinated me about the butterflies was the physical iridescence, which in the northern hemisphere is fairly rare in butterflies. You only get it in these little blue lysinias that you see fluttering around mud puddles in dry areas. I've seen them here. But of course, in the tropics, iridescence becomes a more generalized phenomenon, not only in butterflies, but in beetles as well. And I had the ability to fixate on these things, could spend hours with a single pyrite crystal or a single beetle carcass, just turning it over and looking at it. And then at some point, again, Huxley keeps coming back into this. I decided that I would become a writer, not because I loved writing particularly, but because I admired all the attention that great writers seem to have heaped upon them, which was something that I, as a goggle-eyed weirdo, was not getting much of. And so then the name Huxley recurred again, and I started reading through all of those novels, the social novels, you know, Anti-Hay and Chrome Yellow, After Many a Summer Dives the Swan, and all the rest of it, Eschatonic. And finally, I came to a work of nonfiction by Huxley, The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell. And this was by now probably 1958. I was 14 years old. And in that book, Huxley, the quintessential English academic establishment intellectual, describes his confrontations with mescaline and what it meant to him. And it was fascinating to me because previously all I had ever known or heard about drugs was what I had learned from reading Huxley's novel, Brave New World, which is a pharmacological dystopia, if there ever was one, and has lots to say to society today, I think. If you haven't read it, I recommend it to you. If you have read it, you recall that it was a society of people, perfect people, grown in vats, who died early but who never lost the bloom of their youth, who were herd-minded, driven by advertising, and entirely dependent for their happiness and psychic equilibrium on a drug called soma. And they had little advertising slogans which they would repeat by rote if anyone displayed inappropriate anger or emotion. A gram is better than a dam, they would tell someone who displayed public anger. So it made drugs sound like a fairly dubious proposition. And then here is this same author writing of mescaline and reaching for metaphors drawn from Meister Eckhart, St. John of the Cross, John Chrysostom, comparing the light falling into the folds of his trousers to the light of Caravaggio and Duccio and Fra Angelico. And I was amazed. I had never heard such carryings on. Well, now, if you go back and look at the Doors of Perception, you realize that this was not an extravagant telling of the nature of the psychedelic dimension. It was, in fact, a fairly conservative rendering, a description of low-dose, eyes-open, thoughty psychedelic voyaging. I mean, it's been a long, long time since I've set a stack of Abrams art books by my left knee before I take a psychedelic. But back then, that was how it was done. And you looked at the visible world. Well, so then, around this time, there began to be alarmist articles in the press about the abuse of blue morning glory seeds by some of the more crazed and unassimilated members of American society. And I immediately tore out and purchased a couple of packets of blue morning glory seeds, and then noticed that the leaves imprinted in the fabric of the drapes in the living room all seemed to have little faces and were dancing. This was, in fact, clearly the intent of the designer, but something that in all the years of living around these ratty drapes I had never noticed. And then I began to look at everything around me and discovered that this affinity for looking into things that my rock hunting, butterfly collecting habits had instilled in me had become like turbocharged. And swimming in the depths of polished stones, ponds, the ditch running down the back of the backyard were myriads of worlds. And I went outside and I was looking around at everything, and then I just felt physically overcome. My knees basically gave way underneath me, and I sat down under a tree and I closed my eyes. And my life has never been the same since, because there, waiting behind closed eyelids, were, ruined cities covered with creeping jeweled lichens and inhabited by shining-eyed creatures that were, I was not sure exactly what, and much, much more. And I just spent a half hour or so literally entranced, gazing into this unfolding reverie of deserts, jungles, machines, archaeological artifactoria, machines in orbit around alien worlds, all of this stuff. And I was stunned. I still am stunned. And that essentially set the compass for the rest of my intellectual life. I didn't understand really what had happened. In other words, I didn't clearly get it that this was a trip and that it was induced by the psychedelic. I understood something of that, but I thought also it must be unique. It must be my mood, my expectation. Or surely this cannot happen on demand through the simple act of eating morning glory seeds being sold at 35 cents a pack down at the hardware store. And so then I began to ask questions, and I quickly discovered that was a mistake. So I went back to Huxley and read more carefully, saw that he was working from the earlier work of Havelock Ellis, Weir Mitchell, Fitzhugh Ludlow. It turned out that there was this whole tradition, albeit an underground tradition, in Western intellectual or aesthetic concerns, based around the perturbation of consciousness with substances. Coleridge comes to mind as an example. And you may know his poem Kubla Khan. Kubla Khan was written in a flash, basically, based on an opium reverie. Coleridge was an aficionado of laudanum, which was a tinctured form of opium that had a great vogue in the 19th century. Well, I knew nothing about opium or laudanum or the style of the 19th century English intelligentsia, but in the lines of Kubla Khan, I could feel this same siren song of iridescence that had been in the pyrite crystals, in the butterfly wings, in the beetle bodies. Here, let's go out on a limb and really take a chance here. In Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers girdled round, and there blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion, the sacred river ran. And it goes on, and then it says, it was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. And that notion, not the sunny pleasure dome itself, but the notion of a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice, introduced me to the concept of what is called in alchemy coincidentia positorum, where two things which are mutually exclusive are juxtaposed in a way which creates a shock in the mind, a poetic shock that is then potentially memorable. Years later, I used this effect to title my book. So that's why you get The Invisible Landscape, True Hallucination. See, this is all hideously contrived. Well, eventually, and after many adventures too painful to recall, I ended up at Berkeley in the fall of 1965, which was an incredibly, probably the most together thing I've ever achieved with my life in terms of timing, because I was neither early nor late. I was not 10 miles off or 1,000 miles off. I was dead on. I was right at the very center of the flowering of the Cultural Revolution that is now vilified and fondly recalled as the 1960s. And I was living in a ratty rooming house in San Francisco that summer before going over to Berkeley. And there was a guy living across the hall from me who replaced all the white light bulbs in his apartment with red light bulbs and painted his windows black and played the major chords of Freight Train on his slack guitar over and over again. And he went on to glory as Barry Melton, the lead guitarist of Country Joe and the Fish. And I didn't know it, but at the time they were in the studio laying down the tracks for electric music for the mind and the body, which was one of the defining freak albums of that era. And he introduced me to the joys of cannabis, and further to something called Sandoz LSD, which was going around in these little tiny 00 capsules. And it was as if the previous morning glory vision had now been lifted to a whole other level of intensity. And everyone around me was undergoing these kinds of experiences. And there was a sense of incredibly accelerated change. You could palpably feel the acceleration of change. It seemed to be in the water, in the air. Once I moved to Berkeley, I noticed that the large billboard that they changed over Telegraph Avenue every 30 days contained cryptic messages that were inevitably addressed to me and my affinity group. In short, serious boundary dissolution and category and scramblement was creeping into my mental universe. And then, after about 6 months of this, I had a very strange friend who lived in Palo Alto. He still is my great inspiration. I wish I could coax him into public display, because he's the real Terence McKenna. But if you're the real Terence McKenna, you have too much good taste to ever do what I do. So, but he came to me. His style was to get there first, whatever it was, to do it, to reject it, and to be absolutely contemptuous of it by the time anybody else even arrived at the scene of the crime. So in early 1967, he came to my house in Berkeley one rainy February night, and he said, something you might be interested in. And I said, what's that? And he said, this is a material that has been boosted from an Army research project being run down at SRI, and someone managed to get a 50-gallon drum of this material out of the inventory without anybody knowing. And I said, what is it? And he said, it's called DMT. And I said, it's a psychedelic drug, right? And he said, right. And I said, how long does it last? And he said, 3 minutes. And I said, no problem, bring it on. Because after all, I had been assaulted by Life magazine on the subject of LSD, and I had gotten that under my belt, and I was by now relatively sophisticated about cannabis. I figured there were probably no more frontiers to cross. And so we sat down then and there and did it. And about 15 seconds after choking up on this stuff, I found myself plunged into an elk nest somewhere on the other side of the universe. In other words, there were, and thank God no one fills in for me because they know it so well, jeweled self-dribbling basketballs. Did I get it right? Jeweled self-dribbling basketballs that came bounding toward me from all corners of this domed underground space. Well, I had been used to hallucinations, acceleration of thought, funny ideas, strange insights, hysterical waves of giggling, so forth and so on. I had never seen anything like what I was now face to face with. And also, whatever this substance was, it didn't affect me. It didn't affect my perception of who I was. In other words, it seemed to me that the drug wasn't working. It was simply that the world had disappeared and been replaced by something else. And I was still who I had been a few moments before, except now I was fairly alarmed by what had just happened to the architecture and geography of Southern Telegraph Avenue. And these things, there was an overwhelming sense of affection, involvement, a sense that I hadn't experienced since being 6 years old and being released on Christmas morning to run out to the Christmas tree. And there was a sense of childlike innocence under conditions of extraordinary alienness and unfoldment, and just, I was boggled, the mind boggled. I at last understood the real meaning of this new cliche at that time. And these things were making objects with their voices. They were singing in this unearthly, crystalline, punning, elf chatter kind of language. But it was not something simply heard. It was something which I could see. I could see syntax unfolding like ribbons being spewed out of machines, shooting across my visual field, rolling into balls, condensing as objects with rotating crystalline facets and machined interiors of gold and ivory and chrysolite. And these objects were themselves emitting strange, singing, language-like noises. And the whole thing was happening at an enormous speed, almost like a Bugs Bunny cartoon run backwards at about 3 times ordinary speed. Well, I barely had time to take all of this in and, assure myself that I wasn't dying before it collapsed, the way a tent collapses, the way an ice cream cone melts, the way an erection disappears, the way an investment goes bad. It just was gone. And my friend, I was sitting there, I opened my eyes, and my friend said, "So what do you think?" And I was stunned. I've never actually seen it hit anybody quite as hard as it hit me. For about 15 minutes, all I could say was, "I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I can't believe that. I can't believe that." You call that a drug? You must be nuts. Drugs don't do that. I mean, drugs speed you up, slow you down, make you fall down, stuff like that. This is no drug. It's magic. It masquerades as a drug. It's a doorway into another world. I kept having the image of Aladdin's lamp, my favorite fairy tale, and I felt like Aladdin. You buy something in a junk shop, you take it home, you try to clean it up. The next thing you know, a flame a mile high pours out and demands to do your bidding. That was the impression I had. And it's the impression I still have. That must have been early 1966, 66, 76, 86. What is it? 36 years ago? That's not possible. 26 years ago. Nothing has particularly changed. Nothing has ever surpassed it. And for me, that was the moment that set my auto compass for life. I mean, I said, this I must understand. Not only did my mother not tell me and my father not tell me, but Aldous Huxley never told me, and neither did John of the Cross, and neither did Meister Eckhart. All those people were apparently flying at a lower altitude than I, 19-year-old brat in ratty rented room, have been able to achieve in the last 15 minutes. And so then I began to look for this, or for some trace of it, in the history of human philosophy, in the history of art, in ethnography, everywhere, and I really didn't find it. And I really still don't find it, except there are certain faint footprints in the blowing sand of human experience that if you've seen the vision, you can follow these footprints back to something like this source. First of all, I went to the library. None of the heads that I knew could make any sense out of this at all. For them, LSD defined the top of the ladder. Well, with this stuff, LSD and being at the local PTA meeting down seemed to be two states of mind which merged together on some distant horizon of straightness. So I went to the library and began reading more intensively in a more focused fashion. And I learned that in South America there were tribes of people who apparently utilized plants that had this stuff in it. Now, at that time, this was 67, this was new information that had arrived in the domain of botanical scholarship really in the previous 5 to 10 years through the work of people like Richard Evans Schultes at Harvard and William Safford and other people had described this chemical as being present in these aboriginal intoxicants. So far as I could tell, no academic had ever done it because no description matched what I had experienced. And when I discussed this with my friend who had brought me to this place, he said that he felt that probably it was impossible to attain these kinds of concentrations outside the laboratory. And so that meant, if true, that these shamanic practitioners and societies that were utilizing this were utilizing it, but that they themselves had no real awareness of what it was potentially like when concentrated through modern analytical and laboratory techniques. So it really wasn't a choice. I guess that's what it's like when you get your calling. It's just a little hard for me to imagine that, being a CPA or a city planner or something like that could seize you by the ears with the kind of intensity that this seized me. I said, I've got to understand this stuff. This is the most amazing thing. And the second most amazing thing was that nobody seemed to know about it. I couldn't understand why there weren't 11-inch high headlines on every newspaper on the planet saying, doorway to hyperspace discovered, elf negotiations proceeding, something like that. No, apparently it was a private mystery or known but to a very few. And I immediately after coming down was seized by an absolutely messianic desire to expose other people to this and see what they said, because it just seemed so important to share it. So that's basically what I've been doing ever since, and trying to draw conclusions, trying to understand what is this, number one. How is it that it can coexist with the world of George Bush and not be discussed or not be part of the mix of social concerns? After all, we're a society where people jump out of airplanes on weekends because their lives are so boring and empty. Well, then, if you think jumping out of an airplane is a thrill to write home about, you should try this stuff. No one would jump out of an airplane if they had DMT on their menu. But no, apparently it isn't about that. Well, then I came to feel that it is, and I still sometimes offhandedly refer to it like this, that it is secret. It is not a secret. It is the secret. There is a secret, and this is it. It is the secret that the world is not only not the way you think it is, it's that the way the world is a way that you can't think it is, because you simply do not have the imaginative capacity to conceive of such overwhelming peculiarity. And how this secret is able to coexist with the rest of mundane reality, maintain its integrity, and not become the object of pogrom, religion, hysteria, and repression is part of the mystery of what the secret is. You see, a secret is not something untold. It's something which can't be told. And even as I sit here, I realize that I'm obliquely approaching it. No matter how weird I say it is, no matter what scintillating metaphor I create to attempt to beguile you into imagining what you can't imagine, I'm perfectly aware that I'm falling short of the goal. I'm creating a symbol of what it is. But frankly, words fail, and I'm a word kind of guy. So then, the rest of my life can be basically poured into a nutshell. It's just been a lot of wandering around in various fringy places, talking to a lot of fringy people, and trying to figure out what is the real importance of this for me personally, because that's where I'm living, obviously, and for everybody else, because I assume that there is absolutely nothing extraordinary about me. I didn't have these experiences because I'm in the lineage of Ramana Maharshi or some malarkey like that. I had that experience because I'm a human being. And every human being can have this experience. The only analogy I can make to it is sexuality. I notice that no one here seems to be having sex at the moment, but we all are shaped by it. Probably this is something so taboo and not necessarily scripted into your biological functioning the way sex is. So taboo that you can go from birth to the grave and never encounter this. Not only can you do that, but most people do. And throughout history, most people have. They never had an inkling. You know, they may have set armies marching, they may have launched empires, they may have built fantastic inventions, painted amazing paintings, created phenomenal works of literature, but they were wet behind the ears when it comes to the full spectrum of reality, because without this in the picture, half the world is missing. Well, so then, how to come to terms with this? What is it? The answer is, who knows? We're not doing a very good job of coming to terms with this. Governments inveigh against drugs of all sorts, but largely because these things are sources of difficult to tax revenue. It's not the metaphysical concern for the health of your teleological structures that drives the government to repress these things. It's simply the wish not to be chiseled on, essentially. So this there it is, sideways to the rest of life. Huxley once said of the psychedelic experience generally that it was what he called a gratuitous grace. He said it is neither necessary nor sufficient for salvation. In other words, salvation can be attained without these things, whatever salvation is. Discovering, using, and exploring these things does not guarantee you a place in heaven either, whatever a place in heaven means. However, this is a part of this world, a part of this world that you would think the restless intellectual curiosity of human beings would have brought into a little more close focus than we apparently have. I now, from having spent a lifetime grappling with all this and creating chemical strategies to approach it, intellectual strategies, social strategies, see that this, I think, is what lies behind the pale reflections which it emanates, which we call religions, mystical ecstasies, great works of art, flights of poetic fantasy, perhaps orgasm itself, perhaps the mysteries which lie beyond the grave. All of these things are constellated around that experience, that vista, as the most quintessential distillation of whatever it is these other things bear within themselves in small portions. It's the nexus of beauty and peculiarity and transformational alienness in our lives, in the nexus that the human body and its perceptual engagement with the world represents. And in spite of, turning a lot of people on to this, learning that, it was actually an item of commerce at one point in the underground, in spite of spending time with the Amazonian tribes that use it, in spite of attempting to go back through the art historical record of many cultures and finding traces of this, to this moment, I still think that it is relatively unscathed by mine and everybody else's meager efforts to understand it and assimilate it. It is impossible. It's as impossible this morning as it was that rainy evening 26 years ago. It is the thing which can't exist, and yet which does, and which therefore destroys the central premise not only of our culture, but of culture, period. Because the central premise of culture is we know enough about the world to know what we're doing. We don't. We apparently have not sufficiently explored the natural environment. And when we do, if we can create linguistic engines of description of sufficient robustness, we will then be able to begin to map this thing, which is, anagoglin and cattywampus to ordinary experience, and seems perfectly content to remain there. Most recently, in my book, Food of the Gods, I argue that psilocybin, which turns out to be a relative of DMT, a structural relative, but a far more manageable experience in its content, except at very high doses, that psilocybin may lie in our past in a relationship to the evolution of consciousness such that it's not unreasonable to claim it as the cause of the emergence of self-reflection in the human species. Somehow, this is this state of being, the DMT flash, let's just label it that way. This state of being is the attractor for our movement forward into the future. All of human civilization is an attempt to download into brick, stucco, concrete, glass, plastic, so forth and so on, some intimation of what is glimpsed in that domain. It is not unitary. It is not related to all the white things that various mystical traditions orient themselves toward, the white light, the white this, the white that. It is not void consciousness. It is more the plurabilities, or as Joyce would say, the pluralities. It is all and everything, not merged into a unitary whole, but somehow maintaining their unique self-consistency. It is confounding of all intellectual description that human beings have carried on to this point. And I think that in the form of psilocybin, it probably shaped the emergence of language and self-reflection in our species as we separated ourselves out of the hominid line, the family of advanced primates, that we were one of several members within that family. And instead, we have been drawn into history by the presence of this possibility, this experience. One of the little bumper sticker slogans that I'm fond of repeating is, history is the shockwave of eschatology. Well, eschatology is, first of all, not even a word most people are familiar with in the secular society that we're living in. What is eschatology? What is the eschaton? It refers to final things, the last things. And to say that history is the shockwave of eschatology means that, like the ripples on a pond that precede the breaking of the water's surface by some enormous form moving under the water, history is the agitation of organic nature that occurs for a geological microsecond, say 25,000 years, before the eschatonic object emerges. What is the eschatonic object? Language fails. It can't be told of. It is the thing which cannot be described, which can be analogically apprehended. It's what we offer sacrifice to. It's what we fear. It's what we desire. It is the quintessential union of opposites, not a pair of opposites, but all opposites are unified in the eschaton. For Christianity, it's the second coming of Christ. For Buddhism, it is Shunyata. For Islam, it is the coming of the Imam. For the Jains, it's the return of the Tirthankara. All religions have been culturally defined responses to the sense of the presence of the eschaton in a higher dimension of some sort, drawing us out of biological organization and into a relationship with it, subsumed in its nature. And one thing I've become convinced of over years of dealing with this is that the eschaton is impatient. It is not content to exert steady pressure. It pulls us toward itself with ever greater appetite for merging, for final dissolution of boundaries, to the point that history, which, as I said, is this why, the extraction of resources, the rise in populations, the spread of electronic media, these things cannot be extrapolated thousands of years into the future. There is no time left. So impatient is the eschaton for the final unification in concrescence that all the rest of the history of the universe is going to be compressed into a few decades. This is why religions, many of them, in a fearsome resistance to logical necessity, have insisted that the end of the world is a nearby and reasonably on-schedule proposition. It's because it is, it turns out. Now, some people find this tremendously unlikely and resist the notion of the end of the world as even a possibility. But, we've all been fond of repeating, or it's a cliche of the overeducated, to say, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. You all know what this means, right? Yes? No? No? Oh, it means that if you look at the development of a fetus in the 9 months from fertilization to birth, ontogeny is what that's called, it recapitulates phylogeny. That means that the entire history of the evolution of life on the planet is reflected in the fetus. It goes from being a little free-swimming thing to being a fish-like thing, to being a reptile, to being an amphibian, to being like a mouse or a squirrel, and then it finally flowers into the great and glorious human form. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Well, if that's true, then the end of the world as conceived of by these religions should be of secondary interest to you. It's already decided that your world is going to end with spectacular finality, because what awaits each and every one of us is the yawning grave. That's probably a place to take a hit for sure. So if you think the yawning grave is means you go on to the menu for nematodes, and that's it, that would be probably a fairly dreary perspective to contemplate. But if you believe that the eschaton is what is driving the historical process, then suddenly death begins to look potentially more interesting. If ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, then it is perfectly reasonable to expect the end of the human world at some point. And if you grant that it's going to occur at some point, suddenly the winds of logic are blowing strong at your back when you look at the current state of things to suppose it can't be that far away, because we have painted ourselves into a pretty hellacious corner at this point by the untrammeled expression of Christer cupidity in modern science over the past 1,000 years. So now what we have is, a ruined atmosphere, a poisoned ocean, the spread of incurable epidemic diseases that use our sexuality as the carrier, not-headed political theories that are utterly bankrupt, an economic system that is now devouring its own flesh in an effort to keep the cycle of consumption and production going just 10 or 15 more years before we pay the piper. In other words, we are burning down our house, so it wouldn't be too irrational to suggest that soon we'll be homeless. And that's the situation we occupy vis-a-vis the eschaton. We have burned down our house. It must be God's way of telling us that we're about to move on. And the question is, move on where? Move on how? Well, I don't really have the answers to those questions, but I see that it's not necessary to have the answer to those questions, because the time which separates us from merging with the transcendental object at the end of time is a time of such compressed novelty and such crescent connectedness that more stuff, more events are going to occur in the next 30 years than have occurred in the previous 30,000 years. We are only 20 years from the end of history, but we're only halfway through it. The rest of history is going to have to squeeze itself in to the next 20 years. The appetite for transcendence that locked on to our quietly fruit-eating, fornicating ancestors in the canopies of the African rainforest, that quality that drew us forth into poetry, religion, theater, dance, science, obstetric gynecology, you name it, that force is now drawing us beyond the models that our language can sustain. The mystery which we used to speculate as to whether or not it even existed is now gone from a tiny speck in the eye of science's cheerfully rationalistic maps of reality to a planet-sized object on a collision course with our entire world. We are going down the novelty well. The speed of the descent now contains such kinetic energy that no power in the universe could deflect us from the destiny that we have collectively and incrementally over the millennia chosen. We have shut off all other avenues. This is now what it will be. The confrontation with the other, the conjunctio with the unspeakable alien force that we have been mirroring in our bodies, our language, our art, our magic, our dreams, our hopes for 50,000 to 100,000 years now. And I now see this tremendously intense DMT type vista that I described to you at the beginning of this rap. I now see not what it is in the sense of its being on siege, but I see what it is in the sense of how it could happen. It is simply that because we are animals on one level, evolution, in order to preserve our animal bodies, concentrated our consciousness in three-dimensional space and time, because that's where saber-toothed tigers, marauding neighbors, and other real-time, real-space dangers can be expected to lurk. But what happens when you perturb the physical brain with near cousins of ordinary neurotransmitters, what happens can essentially be described in geometric terms. You are literally the mind, consciousness, unfolds itself from the three-dimensional locus of evolutionary paranoia into a higher dimensional intellectual superspace, which is what Plato called or had in mind when he said time is the moving image of eternity. We are locked down into a point on the conveyor belt of time until we pharmacologically unlock from our place in the linear progression of things and instead rise above the plane of happenstance, and then we see what we never saw before, where the rivers run, where the mountains lie, where the watershed actually causes the psychic and sophic waters of experience to flow. This is what shamans have always known or have always seen. They may not have described it as I've described it, because my description is post-Euclidean, post-Lobachevskian, post-Jungian, and so forth and so on. But this is what they saw. Think about what shamanism in its classical manifestation is about. It's about predicting the weather. It's about seeing where the game went. It's about figuring out who stole the chicken. It's about who violated the laws of sexual exclusivity of the group. And it's about curing. These are all insights easily attained if you have access to a hyperdimensional perspective. You just look, and there's the stolen chicken, and there's where the game will be next week, and there are the weather patterns of 3 moons hence. And so shamans were essentially people protected by the human group and empowered, therefore, to perform a special function. That function being an antenna into hyperspace, so that the group does not wander into an area of food scarcity or an era of moral laxity or a situation of epidemic contagion. In the modern context, with societies as complicated and as technologically driven as our own, when we take the same tools, the hallucinogenic plants and the ecstasy they induce, and apply it to our problems, what we see then is the culmination of the historical process in its dissolved immersion in the concrescent attractor that is this eschatonic mystery. So one way of thinking of a shaman is someone who has seen the end. And when you've seen the end, the whole nature of the opera is transformed, because you can now settle into your padded seat and enjoy the story and appreciate the characterization and the tremendous attention to the scenery and tremendous skill with which the author moves the energy of the narrative from one point to another. You're no longer locked in the drama as if you didn't know what was going to happen. And this gives you an existential authenticity which the people around you can sense, and so they call you a wizard, a magician, a shaman, a magic maker, an exemplar. It's simply that you have come to terms with experience by assimilating the totality of it. And now you live life with a lightened hand. And if you're good at it, you can spread that attitude to other people, and then they too can know a measure of peace of mind and Taoistic acceptance and relief.